Hey, Fred, good morning.
Good morning, Jeff.
Hey, nice to hear from you.
Well, it's nice to be heard from. I've been looking through all of my notes on the Egyptian election.
Yeah.
And as we used to say in Congress, I've come to no conclusion thereon. Supposedly they're officially going to certify the results tomorrow, but don't hold your breath. And I got to tell you, Jeff, I would be terribly worried about this outcome if I didn't know that the Carter Center was on duty monitoring these elections. So I'm sure everything will be okay. But before we get into the state of play, let's just review the bidding about these two candidates.
Yeah.
The Muslim Brotherhood candidate, Mohammed Morsi, as you may know, came in to the nomination process at the last minute when they rejected their former candidate, and prior to this, he was not on anybody's radar. So this is the Egyptian equivalent of nominating Gary Johnson as the party favorite. Okay, that's him. Now Ahmed Shafiq, who is the supposed heir apparent to Mubarak,
Right.
was supposedly disqualified from running too because there is a provision somewhere in Egyptian law, at least at this point, that says if you served in the Mubarak regime, you were disqualified for running for public office, okay? So he's not really a legitimate candidate. If you add to that the recent decision by the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces and their Supreme Constitutional Court that the Egyptian parliament is illegitimate because those elections, you don't have a legitimate process anywhere in the entire country, which may be why both candidates are declaring not only that they won, but they essentially won by the same margin. Okay, figure that one out, President Carter.
Wow.
So here's where we are.
Okay.
And I'm just going to kind of cut through the demographics and get to the politics.
Yeah.
The Muslim Brotherhood, I think, realizes it cannot win a conventional battle with the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which has held power really since 1952.
Okay.
But what they can do, and what they are trying to do right now, is win a public relations battle. And that's one of the reasons they declared victory first, because if they get out in front of this and say that Mohammed Morsi is the winner, and they get some kind of certification tomorrow,
Right.
then if the military overturns the election, they become the presumptive underdogs. And I think in terms of U.S. support, particularly with this particular administration and in particular the State Department
Right.
and people like John Kerry who have met with them, that essentially argues in their favor and gives them a kind of sympathy vote in the short run. Meanwhile, of course, I think you'd be foolish to bet against the military, who's been in power for so long and has controlled this process and has already taken measures to weaken, if not totally diminish, the office of the presidency. So in the short run, I would have to say that the Army in some way is going to stay in power, and the net result of the Arab Spring in Egypt is you had a major upheaval, and so far, very little change. And I think one of the results that you're seeing in this election is a lot of Egyptians went to the polls saying, God, look what happened in Tunisia, look what happened in Libya, and look what is happening right now in Syria.
Right.
Do we really want the Muslim Brotherhood to be in charge of our government? But my final point is this, and I think this is the most serious one. Regardless of what happens, I think you can bank on increased hostility to Israel. Asymmetric kinds of war. You know, there was a rumor that supposedly the Muslim Brotherhood ordered a missile strike into Israel from the Sinai, and that also corresponds to an attack on some Israeli soldiers who, you know, Israel's building a fence along the Sinai border. And shortly after the elections, a couple of Israeli soldiers, or at least a construction worker was killed, and there was a fight at the border. And there is still some speculation that the Muslim Brotherhood ordered all of that. So,
now, Fred, but let me ask you this. If, in fact, it is the Egyptian military that has really been in charge behind the scenes, pulling the strings for more than, half a century at this point?
Oh, sure.
And for the last 25, 30 years, they've been okay playing nice with Israel. What's the benefit to them now to engage in any sort of behavior that is seen as antagonistic? Because I've got to think that the Egyptian military doesn't want the crazy people in Iran getting a nuclear weapon either.
No, you're absolutely right about that. And the one name you'll not see on the ballot, perhaps the most powerful person in Egypt now and in the past and possibly in the future, is Field Marshal Tantawi, who is the head of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. And this is the guy, by the way, who shows up on Capitol Hill with members of CENTCOM to lobby for the $1.5 billion, and that is essentially the insurance paid down on the Camp David Accord. So he's going to say, give us this money and we won't go to war with Israel. But what he's not saying, and what I think is the accommodation to the Brotherhood and the growing Islamist sentiment in Egypt, is that's not going to keep us from using terrorist groups and jihadists and rogue missiles to fire into Israel until we provoke a response from them, which then, of course, would entail more of a full-scale war. And that's really the big if, Jeff, as to whether or not we will be inched into a kind of conflict where Israel is forced to defend itself either in the north with Iran, as we've talked about, or in the south with Egypt. And to me, that is the story that's not being reported in the Middle East right now, as to just how long Israel can hold out as these forces begin to converge on them asymmetrically.
Is Israel going to act against Iran before the U.S. presidential elections in November?
At this point, I would say no, but I'm hedging my bet contingent on what happens in Syria. I am praying that we do not get involved in Syria, because right now what we're seeing is an outcome that is really in our favor. You've got Hezbollah and Hamas fighting one another. You've got Sunnis and Shiites arguing over territory. Why would we want to get into that mix? They both hate us.
That's exactly
We're the one force that unites these century-old enmities.
That's right. The one thing they agree on is that we are infidels. Yeah. All right.
We hate you. We hate Israel a little bit more, but who's counting?
Exactly. Fred.
That's it.
Thank you, sir. Former Congressman Fred Grandy. He's now with the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C. What a great guy. We love having Fred with us. We really, really do.